Warning: as this video deals with political figures, it will have some of my own personal political views. If you are easily offended by this, just know that any hostile, trolling comments will be blocked. My channel, my rules. Also, this video is meant for an older audience, and, as such, contains humor, language, and imagery that may not be suitable for children. You know, when I was first writing this video, I was originally planning to start with a "things could always be worse" type of comment at the beginning. But in the wake of these events, that would be really disrespectful and trite. Instead, all I can do is say that I hope you really enjoy this episode, because we all could use a good laugh right now. Anyway, without further ado, hello, and welcome to Farcical Moments from History, where I look at various events that, as ridiculous as they sound, really happened. In this episode, we will look, in chronological order, at 4 of the most embarrassing things to ever occur on Inauguration Day, ranging from improper behavior during otherwise esteemed ceremonies to glaringly stupid decisions made by either the president or his handlers. On March 4th, 1841, yeah, there used to be a longer period in between an election and Inauguration Day. Thank fucking God that's no longer the case. William Henry Harrison was sworn in as the 9th President of the United States. He had gained fame as a general on the frontier, where he battled Tecumseh's tribal confederacy at the Battle of Tippecanoe and during the War of 1812, where he decisively defeated it and its British allies, opening the way for further subjugation of native tribes and seizure of tribal lands, which was the early 19th century version of the American dream. He also was the rising star of the emerging Whig Party, which championed for government investment in infrastructure, a federalized financial system to promote economic stability, tariffs against imported goods, investment in emerging technology, and limiting presidential power. In addition, it was also against aggressive territorial expansion. As you can see, the Whig Party was one that really wouldn't fit well into today's politics, given how they did support massive federal regulation, but at the same time wanted the presidency itself to be in office with very little power. In the preceding election of 1840, Harrison presented himself as a less volatile alternative to former General Andrew Jackson, whose presidency had been marked by unprecedented wielding of aggressive executive power and utter contempt for those who opposed his policies, as a means of attacking his opponent Martin Van Buren, who had been Jackson's vice president in his second term and his hand-picked successor. Harrison also presented himself as a humble man of the frontier, having the log cabin as the symbol of his campaign, despite actually being the product of a privileged upbringing back in Virginia. Since I guess you could get away with that back then without being immediately signaled out as being completely full of shit. While this propagandizing actually worked, it did cause many to question whether he had the intelligence to effectively govern. Also, his age was considered an issue, as he was in his late 60s by this time. Huh. How quaint that was considered too old back then. And there was doubt that he had the physical strength needed to deal with the stressful conditions of the presidency. Harrison, in an effort to silence his critics, decided to use his inauguration as a means to demonstrate his physical and intellectual prowess by giving a nearly 2-hour-long speech, the longest inauguration address in the history of the United States, all while braving the elements on what was an especially cold and wet day in the nation's capital. To make things worse, he did so without wearing a hat, overcoat, or gloves, and had insisted on riding a horse to the ceremony rather than travel in a carriage. Afterward, he got back on his horse for the inaugural parade and spent the evening going to several inaugural balls. Just 3 weeks later, Harrison began developing cold-like symptoms. Shit, here we go. Within days, he had fallen gravely ill, and his doctors diagnosed him with pneumonia. On April 4th, just 1 month after his term began, Harrison was dead, resulting in the shortest presidency to have ever occurred. This prompted the first great succession crisis in the nation's history, as the Constitution was very vague about what would happen if a president died. In the end, Vice President John Tyler, a militant Southern states' rights and territorial expansion advocate, who, fun fact, would spend the last few years of his life showing just how much he really cared about the nation by serving as a member of the Confederate Congress, had himself sworn in not as an acting president, but officially as the nation's 10th president. Following this, John Tyler quickly went to work putting an end to the Whig Party's agenda. See, you should never underestimate how devastating the act of stupidly ignoring health guidelines and common sense can be. On March 4th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln prepared to be inaugurated to his second term as the nation's 16th president. By this time, the American Civil War had raged for nearly 4 years, having so far cost the lives of over 600,000 people, or 2% of the nation's population. That would be the equivalent of over 6.5 million people by today's standards. And yet, there was a rising feeling of hope in a brighter future for the nation, as not only had Congress just passed the 13th Amendment, which, upon ratification by the states, would officially outlaw slavery in the nation, but news from the front lines in the past few months indicated that the end of the war was finally in sight, as the Confederate war effort was on the precipice of total collapse. Looking ahead to the country's future after the war, Lincoln, rather than calling for retribution against those who had cast their lot with the Confederacy, appealed for malice toward none and charity for all, to be encouraged so as to ensure a lasting peace in what would become one of the most revered inaugural addresses in the nation's history. Now, what many people don't know is that Lincoln's address had been preceded by some of the most embarrassing behavior to ever occur on Inauguration Day, when his Vice President Andrew Johnson was sworn in. Andrew Johnson was not the sort of man who you would have immediately associated with Lincoln. Whereas Lincoln had, by this point, embraced the notion that an essential part of rebuilding the nation after the war would be establishing citizenship rights of some kind to former slaves, Johnson, as a 19th century Southern Democrat, felt that the only things that were important in rebuilding the nation were to reestablish Southern state governments and political/economic relations between the North and the South, and that little effort should be made by the federal government to promote the well-being of former slaves. Johnson, however, was the only senator from a Confederate state to remain loyal to the Union, and thus had been chosen as Lincoln's running mate during the election of 1864 to broaden the appeal of his campaign. Certainly not to become president if Lincoln died, since, with the war being almost over, the likelihood of Lincoln's life being in danger was clearly remote. In a great example of displaying piss-poor judgment, Johnson spent the night before the inauguration at a party in his honor, during which he drank heavily. As to be expected, Johnson awoke the next day with a massive hangover. On his way to the Senate chamber, where he was supposed to give his inaugural address, he asked outgoing Vice President Hannibal Hamlin for some whiskey, declaring that, "I need all the strength for the occasion I can have." This, of course, proved to be a disastrous decision on Johnson's part, as his address ended up being a rambling, incoherent mess that ended with Hamlin quickly swearing him in as the new vice president, while the bewildered audience, which included a deeply embarrassed Lincoln, looked on. Following his public humiliation, Johnson kept himself in relative isolation for the next several weeks. Everything, however, changed on the night of April 14th when, just 5 days after the surrender of the Confederacy's main army, General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, Lincoln was fatally shot at Ford's Theater by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth as part of a plot to decapitate the federal government. All of a sudden, Johnson found himself sworn in as the 17th President of the United States, tasked with overseeing the recovery of a traumatized nation. A duty that he ended up being completely fucking incapable of serving. Instead, his desire to forsake freed slaves and restore the severed states as quickly as possible would not only help to create resentments that would plague the nation to this very day, but led him suffering the ultimate sign of failure as a president by being not only the first president to be impeached, but also being spared removal from office by a single vote, thus ensuring that he would forevermore go down in the nation's history as one of its worst presidents. On March 4th, 1933, the United States was facing its greatest crisis since the Civil War. As a result of reckless speculation and unregulated commerce and manufacturing, the nation had found itself, starting with the stock market crash of 1929, in the worst economic downturn in its history, with nearly half of the nation's banks failing. Remember, this was a time when there was no insurance for people's bank savings. 13 million, or nearly a quarter of the nation's available workforce, losing their jobs. In an era without any unemployment benefits. Industrial production falling to half its previous levels. Over 1 million farms being foreclosed on. And millions being evicted from their homes by 1933. Bearing the brunt of the nation's outrage and despair was President Herbert Hoover, who, due to his belief in a limited federal government, was seen as not doing anything of consequence to enable economic recovery. This led to him being soundly defeated in his re-election bid in 1932, in favor of New York's charismatic Democratic governor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a fifth cousin to the immensely popular President Theodore Roosevelt, who pledged to establish a New Deal of direct government action to promote economic recovery. Now, on what would be the last March inauguration in the country's history, as a result of the recent ratification of the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, which reassigned inauguration date to January 20th, Roosevelt prepared to be sworn in as the nation's 32nd president. In his iconic address, Roosevelt appealed for the nation to not submit to despair.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
And made it clear that he would vigorously advocate for direct federal intervention to restore prosperity in the nation, even if Congress was unwilling to support him.
But, in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe.
Unfortunately, Hoover, bitter over being blamed for the Depression, and convinced that Roosevelt was a callous, power-hungry charlatan who was gaslighting the people and would make the Depression worse, refused to converse with him in any meaningful way that day. Roosevelt, however, brushed off Hoover's rebuke by displaying his characteristic smile during his inaugural parade. This contrast in personas that day would cause Hoover to be further humiliated by the public's mockery, which would follow him for the rest of his life. Of course, Hoover's pettiness just comes off as quaint and inconsequential now, compared to the nightmarish disconnect from reality we've been seeing in the past few months. Oh goody! More shenanigans with Nixon for me to talk about. On January 20th, 1973, Richard Nixon was sworn in for his second term as the 37th President of the United States, having won one of the biggest landslide victories ever in the election of 1972. A victory that was the result of insidious manipulation of the public and attempts to sabotage his political enemies that were of very questionable legality. But that's a subject I'll probably cover in a future video. Seeing his victory as vindication against his perceived enemies, Nixon wanted to flaunt his re-election victory by making his inaugural parade as perfect as possible. This included the local wildlife, as Nixon and his aides didn't want pigeons to, dive-bomb the festivities, shall we say. To avoid this, they had the trees lining Pennsylvania Avenue treated with chemical substances that were supposed to repel birds. However, as the parade commenced, scores of pigeons ended up flocking to these trees and consumed the highly toxic chemical substances. Soon enough, pigeons began dropping dead all over Pennsylvania Avenue, putting a little bit of a damper on the festivities. This mishap ended up being fittingly symbolic, as Nixon's second term ended up being defined by a scandal that would end up proving fatal to his presidency: Watergate. Of course, that was a scandal that comes off as mere child's play today. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell. Also, follow me on Twitter at PCNHGuy. If you want to help me make more videos similar to this, or you just want to support my channel, maybe consider contributing to my Pop Culture and History Guy Patreon, and get a shout out in my future videos and other benefits. Have a nice day.